Okay. So I would say vulnerability chaining is still one of those things we've been. So the CVSS started talking about vulnerability chaining many years ago because there is an option when analysts submit vulnerabilities for CVSS scoring to be submitted as a CVE ID that lives in the National Vulnerability Database. There's a way for analysts to submit vulnerabilities that have possible vulnerability chains. Up until I would say maybe 2 years ago, and there's really only been a couple of vendor cases around vulnerability chaining. Like Microsoft Active Directory, there were two chained vulnerabilities last year that we saw. Recently, we've seen two VMware vulnerabilities that were chained together in the vRealize log site or log insight tool. And so we're starting to see that a little bit more, but a lot of vulnerability chains are not disclosed as chains. And it's really because if someone's submitting a CVE ID, it's one vulnerability in one product. Vulnerability chains can exist across multiple products. And so we're still sort of in that limited space of how do you actually look at and address vulnerability chains in the environment. And so I take it from a technology and a people perspective where, the technology, we're still figuring out how do we identify these vulnerability chains, especially across the entire enterprise. And then from a people perspective, which is what I focused a lot of my research on, is how do we get people to understand vulnerability chaining, especially when they're considering remediation activities? So how do we prioritize fixing vulnerabilities that might actually break a vulnerability chain? So I think we're working towards that as an industry, but I would say that there isn't a ton of really great guidance out there. There's some good stuff on exploit chaining. They're calling it exploit chaining now, but it's kind of potato. But yeah, so I think we're starting to see more about that. But yeah, I've been researching this since 2017, and APT groups and malicious actors, they know how to do vulnerability chains, but I think we need more information on the network defense side.
I love it. Just going to see if there's a piggyback to it because for a while, especially during COVID, all we heard about was blockchain. Does blockchain provide a vulnerability chain detection component, or is it completely outside of the realm that we would use something like that?
I think if it was used in the right way, maybe it could be. I think there's probably a lot of good possibility out there for us to still create and develop things outside of blockchain. I'm probably biased because I'm not a big proponent of blockchain, but I do think that if we could find a way to leverage it and that it would work really well for that, then I'm all for it. But I think we still, like we were talking about, we're still sort of doing the secure configuration. We're still doing the basics. I think we might not be quite there yet. But I hope to see some more good tooling and guidance in the future.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think there's a time and place for blockchain to grow. I think that if they could actually prove immutability, right, then you have something. But I feel like a lot of times people are throw that at the wall. And I think a lot of our listeners are going to go, is it possible with what you're looking at? And I think the art of possible here is putting your heads together as humans and finding a better path.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's really about, I step back. So when I did the DSC, I focused very heavily on the technical components of vulnerability scoring around vulnerability chaining. And when I did the human factors PhD, I really stepped back and I said, hold on a minute. That first study I did, they didn't even really know what I was talking about. And I need to make sure that people understand the language, the terminology, the actual phenomenon, like what vulnerability chaining actually is, before we can really get into how do we build proper scoring or proper guidance or any of those other things around it. So I think we're still sort of in that area where people are still discovering vulnerability chaining or exploit chaining. So I think once we can get the word out there more, which is why I love doing podcasts and public speaking and talking about vulnerability chaining, because I'm hoping that people hear about it and want to learn more.
You've heard it here.
Yeah, exactly.